you so much for joining us on this CNBC special. And today we're looking at Andela, a talent accelerator that prepares African developers and connects them with top employers globally. It has also expanded into Rwanda by setting up the very first Pan-African Tech Hub. Joining us on the show is the CEO and co-founder of Andela, Jeremy Johnson, and the Vice President, Sheni Suleiman. Hope I got it so right. Thanks, gentlemen, for having time to sit down with us.
Thank you for having us.
First things first, it must be an exciting time for Andela. I mean, just last year you raised about $40 million US. But let's take a step back before even the funding with Zuckerberg Foundation and all this, fame that the company is getting and the expansion plans. How was it starting out in Africa, especially as a startup?
Looking back at 2014, it's one of those things where we learned a bunch of lessons early that I think we probably didn't fully know what we were getting into. And at the same time, they prepared us for the next couple of years in really meaningful ways. I think the fact that we had so we have 6 co-founders, and 3 are from Africa, 2 Nigeria, 1 Cameroon, and then 3 from North America, I think really helped a lot. If it hadn't been for that, I think the first few years would have been, there are probably half a dozen different times where we would have said, you know what, this is just going to be too hard or too difficult. And thankfully, because of that diverse group of people, we were able to work through it and learn from those challenges instead. And I think that's a big part of why we are here today, 4 years later, the ability to bring together diverse viewpoints in order to understand really what is the best possible strategy and approach.
You have worked in the African tech sphere for some time, I suppose. It's not quite easy to start out. Many startups, have failed, and yet many still look for funding. Now, working for Andela, just give us an idea of your early beginnings. How was it?
Sure. So I joined Andela in 2016, and a bit later than when it started.
Yeah.
And essentially, what most companies do is they go through different phases in their sort of livelihood, if you will. As startups, you get to the very early stage where you're launching and trying to make sure you have what they call product market fit. Is this going to actually work? And at some point beyond that, what you're looking at is, how do I scale this thing? How do I grow the business? How do I really create a business out of this startup? So when I joined Andela, that was really the focus of my presence there. I began as the director of operations in Nigeria, and then I moved on to the lead Nigeria as a country director. Ultimately, my job there was really just make Andela Nigeria into an awesome business that people would look up to and aspire to join eventually, which is where we were now. In the last few months,
Which, not to interrupt you, but was just a testament to that leadership.
Yeah.
Literally just honored as the best place in Nigeria to work.
and also the best place in Africa to work.
Yeah.
Apparently.
Okay, we'll get to that story later. But I want to understand the basics of how all this works, especially to our viewers. How does it work? How many applications do you get, like, per job? I'm assuming an American would say you're taking away their jobs, eh?
So you'd think that, and yet at the same time, there are actually in America 5 open jobs for every software developer looking for one. And so there's zero chance the domestic market will actually solve the problem. For American companies, and this is a truism for global companies around the world, if you're growing quickly, the biggest challenge you face, ask CEOs of the fastest growing companies in the world, it's hiring technical talent. Because you just don't have enough people with the right skill set to be able to, in particular, build software. And so what Andela is doing, actually, we've literally never had a company say, we're going to lay off any of our existing developers in order to bring on Andela developers. Our partners are growing so quickly, and they need so much that only by being able to bring on additional developers through Andela are they able to then hire people in other areas. So it actually, I know exactly what you mean, and we hear the question all the time, but in technology, additional access to talent is accretive. It actually builds on top of itself, and it allows companies to continue building.
Can I actually bring this to life just a little bit for the viewers here? You know, what's happening in the world today is there's a lot of money that is trying to advance the world, advance human potential. And one of the biggest barriers that people are facing is talent. And what that really means from a very just tangible, practical perspective is, in healthcare, the people that have amazing ideas of how to solve problems that we all face today. in transportation, there are lots of issues there people are trying to solve, in security, and the list goes on. What the world is experiencing today is we cannot enjoy the things that we should. Our lives are slightly less good than they should be because there are a bunch of companies there that cannot add the new feature, they cannot build a new product, they cannot expand what they're offering because they just do not have the people to build it. So the problem we're solving is one where the world is actually moving slower than it should because the entire world is not producing enough technical talent. And as a result, we are actually going through pains that we don't have to go through today.
I want to understand how you get this kind of talent, because Africa, for it, is even trying to catch up with the fourth industrial revolution. Africa still has a skills gap, really huge gap, that could be one of the problems we have on the continent. How do you find these people?
Well, there's a skills gap, but not a talent gap.
Yeah.
There's not an ability gap. Brilliance, talent, one's potential actually has nothing to do with race, gender, nationality. It's totally evenly distributed around the world.
Do you take these people through some kind of nurturing or some kind of training?
Exactly. And so we've had 75,000 people, a little more than that now, apply to join Andela. After someone is accepted, they then spend the next 6 months working with Andela on internal systems and building out their competency, but also proving mastery of over 1,000 different learning objectives, which allow us to understand exactly where someone is in their journey to becoming a great software developer. So we are very involved in that exposure and creating that platform for that potential to showcase itself to the world.
What has been the progress in terms of numbers? Just give us a brief overview of the growth in the past 4 years.
I mean, started out with 6 of us, and now we're a little over 1,100, growing by somewhere around 50 people a month. Yes. And so it's growing pretty quickly.
It's a very fast-growing organization.
I understand, but in terms of the milestones, if you look at the expansion that you've done, what would you point out?
I mean, I think the biggest was obviously starting off in Nigeria, but then opening up Kenya a year later. Was a huge milestone, and Andela Kenya is now nearly as large as Andela Nigeria. Andela Uganda was the third, and that's only about a year old, but already well over 100 people. And this announcement today is a huge milestone for us. This is our first Pan-African Andela Hub, and for us, this is just an extraordinary chance to enable the people that have been applying to Andela from around the continent, from the 50 countries that we don't operate in, to have a chance to take part in the movement that Andela is building.
That's the MOU you've just signed with the Rwanda Development Board. How is it going to operate? Just give us a detailed idea of how the tech hub is going to operate, how different it is from the usual hubs we have across the country.
Yeah, most tech hubs, and there's a lot of value to all different types of tech hubs, but most tech hubs are focused on company building and trying to launch companies. Andela is more focused on skill development and cultivating the next generation of leaders. So we care about and are just very focused on talent. And so we identify those high potential aspiring or existing developers and help cultivate the exposure and talent needed to be able to operate as full-time team members for companies around the world. And so it is tech in the sense that each of those software developers is building technology. They're literally building the future with technology, and they're doing it in a way that contributes to their skill development, but also directly translates into a job. It's not a function of needing to try to create a company. Not that there's anything wrong with that, obviously. That's an awesome outcome. But even before that, it creates the foundation and the skills needed to be an excellent developer. And that is the limiting factor for a lot of companies in their growth.
I think this ties into what you find it, if you look at most, actually why this is particularly exciting and in general, you look at most technology ecosystems around the world. I think everyone usually points to Silicon Valley as the sort of prototypical one. You'll find a combination of tech hubs there, but also lots and lots of companies that have engineers. For many parts of Africa, what the tech hubs are really doing is helping to drive entrepreneurship. And they're focusing on helping people to build new businesses from scratch. But ultimately, once those businesses get large, they sort of move out of the tech hubs because they're actually now operating businesses. Andela is an engineering organization. You can think of us the way you would think of sort of any of the large companies that is today renowned in the world as a tech company. We have employees who work at Andela whose daily jobs is building really, really awesome software. They're not building startups. They're working within existing engineering teams, building new products or really enhancing some of the best products in the world out there. And so that's kind of the biggest difference between us and many of the other organizations you'll see. And I'd love to spend more time on that if you have additional questions.
There's been, to both of you, there's been a bit of criticism, especially when it comes to tech developers in Africa, or even the startups in Africa. Same way the Americans would say, you're taking away their jobs, Africa says you're taking away their skills. I mean, one of the things that has been pointed out, especially as a challenge to creating a sustainable tech ecosystem, is because of the lack of skills or even engineers in Africa. These are people you're taking out of Africa to other countries. Help me throw in something on that.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the way that countries like India developed over the past few decades, frequently what one had to do was, in order to gain exposure to high-end technical environments, people had to leave and move to the United States or Europe in order to do it. Now, because of the evolution of technology, people at Andela don't have to leave their country. And so it actually doesn't require people moving to other countries to gain the kind of exposure you'd have if you were to send a few hundred of the most best and brightest to Silicon Valley to work for a few years. That exposure would be incredible for those people. But now you don't need those people to actually leave in order to do it. You can gain that kind of exposure and build those skills in the local ecosystem. And so as opposed to brain drain, you're actually bringing skills and bringing sort of know-how about some of the fastest growing, most successful companies in the world directly into the countries we operate in.
I'd like to talk about that from the perspective of someone who led one of these countries and how I think about that. Ultimately, just like Jeremy said, Andela's developers live in their home country or in the country where they operate in. They're waking up every day.
They're not working for local companies.
Sorry? We've actually worked with local companies across. Ultimately, we actually do not discriminate in terms of what companies we work with. We look for certain characteristics in the types of organizations, and the reason for that, as someone who's from the continent, it is very, very important for me and for everyone at Andela that the people that go through Andela, the developers we hire and we sort of help to become global software developers, get the best possible experience, because that is the only way this continent will develop. You need people that have worked in some of the best ecosystems, have worked alongside some of the best technical talent out there and the best leaders out there, because then they can take all of that experience and bring it. I spent over a decade in the US. I grew up in Nigeria. I spent my childhood there. I left Nigeria, went to the US for university. I worked in the US, worked in Canada, went to school in the US, and ultimately one day I woke up and said, you know what, now I think I have what it takes to go back home and build something. And I'm bringing a lot of my experiences from across the world to Nigeria now, and I think it makes me a better person. I didn't have the benefit of being able to do this from Nigeria. Andela's developers do. I didn't want to leave home. When I was leaving Nigeria, I actually cried. I was very young, and Andela's developers don't have to leave. They can wake up every day and plug in to the global tech ecosystem. They can learn the skills that are there. They can develop the competencies that are there. While they're doing that, they're already working in their local communities. We have an organization called Team Code. A bunch of developers woke up one day and said, you know what, I have this experience, but a lot of young people don't. We should basically go and give back to the community. This was not an Andela project. They just started this themselves. And we have Tech in Pink, which is a bunch of women developers realized that there are other women that should be learning this, and they started teaching women how to code. So there are several things that already, within a year or 2 or 3 of existing, there are many, many ways in which the devs at Andela begin to really impact the local communities. And I think that's what I'm really excited about. So even before, I think people think of this as people come and work at Andela, they spend some years, they acquire all these skills, and then eventually they give back. From day one, everyone at Andela has mentors, people they went to school with. They're looking up to them and saying, hey, you are now a global tech leader. Can I talk to you once every 2 weeks? I have this problem, can you help me solve it? So they're working with startups locally, they're advising startups locally. We've had a few developers that have actually gone and taking pretty senior roles at local companies, and they're helping them accelerate their journey faster than they might otherwise. So, in reality, I don't think that there's any risk of us not, looking back in a few years and thinking this was not a great idea. I think we're already seeing it today, that the local communities are benefiting from our presence and the presence of many other companies that have, connections to these global ecosystems.
I want to throw this to both of you. What influences your expansion decisions? We know that you're expanding into Egypt. You just signed an MOU in Rwanda. What are some of the things you look out for when you get into these countries?
So we are expanding into Rwanda, and we're really excited about it. Egypt isn't actually an expansion country for us. We've seen a couple different people posting about this. In Egypt, all we're doing is bringing on a small team of senior developers. So it's not the full learning experience that is the hallmark of Andela. And so just to be super clear, Egypt has not been decided as a country yet for us. It's an amazing country, but that is not an official thing. Rwanda absolutely is, and we're really excited to be here.
In fact, one would ask, why not Egypt and South Africa? These are some of the biggest, tech countries on the continent. What influences the countries you go to?
So think about it through another lens. Where does the world not realize that brilliance exists yet? And you're right, there are significant tech ecosystems in both Egypt and South Africa. There's incredible talent in a lot of other countries that the world doesn't realize. And we think of it as part of our mission to help show the world that brilliance is evenly distributed.
I want to touch on this now that we're moving into more of the conversation. Now, a report by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, this was breaking the pattern, came out to say that over 90% of funding for African tech startups typically goes back to expatriate founders. Now, there's been a lot of criticism, especially when it comes to Andela, with many startups in Africa saying, you're taking a lot of their money. Vis-a-vis them, the startups that are actually based on the ground. Would you like to throw a comment on this?
Of course. I mean, I certainly understand the question, but the reality is for the vast majority of our early investors, we were their first exposure to the continent. And most of them have now made subsequent investments in Africa because of the comfort that they've gotten. In tech, what ends up happening is the more attention that an ecosystem gets, the more interest it then attracts from investors. And so our hope and expectation is that we will continue to see more and more funding coming into the continent, and that we're going to be an example for investors around the world, but also African investors. Our Series C was led by an African venture fund, and we've had African, going back to our angel investors, we've had African representation on the cap table. But it's something that we think that we can actually help drive a lot more funding into the ecosystem, and that's something we're really excited about. I mean, Shani, what have you seen?
I think it's exactly that. So I probably look at it from three different perspectives. Yeah. The first is just a few months ago, I got a call from one of our investors, and he said, "Hey, have you heard of this company, this startup?" And I said, "Oh, absolutely, I've heard of them. The founder is one of my mentees. I'm actually an advisor." He said, "Oh, I'm thinking about investing in them. What do you think?" And he made the investment. It was actually pretty substantial, and that company is doing pretty well right now. Right now in my inbox, in my email, I have an email from what we call a friend of Andela, who's really a strong advocate, who's right now looking at making a deal and making an investment on the continent as well. And he emailed me saying, "Hey, I'm thinking about this thing. Do you think it's a good idea?" Almost every month, there's someone asking, "Hey, I heard about this startup in Lagos, or I heard about this startup in Nairobi. What do you think? Do you think it's a great idea?" And I'm sure Jeremy gets 10 times more than that even. What has happened truly is people that did not know that you could find really, really great talent here are now finding out about that. And everyone likes a secret, right? Everyone wants to find the thing that's new. And so what is happening now, they're looking and saying, there are people in Africa that can build global companies before everyone else finds out about it.
I want to touch more on that, because when you look at San Francisco alone, it has a GDP that is competing globally, just the city alone, because of the tech, the tech industry. Coming back to Africa, there's been a lot of debates, especially when it comes to the private sector, or having African investors putting money into startups. I'm sure this is something you would love to touch on. Have you had lots of African investors coming to put into money in Andela?
Our African investors have been actually some of the cornerstones of every single fundraising round we've had, going back to the very beginning. Yeah, even look at our seed investors. Pule Taukobong from CRE, it was African Angels Network before he changed the name of it. But yeah, he was in our friends and family round, pre-seed. And so they've been a critical part of really one of our first two independent board members was Nigerian. Again, 3 of our co-founders were also African, so that may be atypical. But we've had a lot of folks from the continent play really critical roles early on in what has become this story.
I want to touch on the fact that you're expanding. This also comes with lots of challenges. Africa alone has very challenges from internet penetration
Wait, really?
to infrastructure, bureaucracy.
No, not Nigeria. Nigeria doesn't have any of this challenges.
No, I'm saying Africa. Let's look at the continent itself. Anyway.
Kigali, you have the first fully 4G city on the continent.
Exactly, but Kigali alone is 13 million. I want to look at a continent that is looking at a 2 billion market in the next 10 years or 20 years, with its vast challenges. About 6 million people without access to electricity, about only 28% internet penetration. With this 4 years that you've been in the industry for you, what have been some of the challenges? What have been some of the hindrances that you've come across?
Honestly, I understand why it's interesting to talk about the challenges. I think what's even more interesting is to talk about what's happening across the continent. Yeah. Like there's a narrative that is particularly challenging in the West, I think, that doesn't help the continent, that is mostly focused on challenges. And yeah, there are challenges across the continent. And guess what? Like in the US, we've got some serious challenges, a whole host of challenges. And most startups fail in every environment. So yes, we've had to overcome lots of challenges, but what has been really fascinating and an honor to be part of over the past 4 years has been the extraordinary growth, the unbelievable people, the drive and the hustle, the people that have taken bus rides across country lines to cities they've never been to apply to a program with a 1% acceptance rate, get in and didn't tell us that they'd done that.
Shane is relating to Nigeria.
That is what's extraordinary. And so we can talk about the challenges, and there are a bunch, but that's not what I think is the interesting story. And that's part of what I love about Kigali so much, is that this story, what's happening in Kigali, what has happened over the past couple of decades, what's going to happen in the next couple of decades, is extraordinary. It is one of the best, most interesting, human stories in the world today. And it's just not talked about enough.
It's actually interesting, especially for Kigali, because you just signed an MOU with the governments. How has it been with the public-private partnerships in other countries you've gone to?
This is a first for us in such a significant way. And the biggest driver really is the ability for it to be a Pan-African hub. For each country before, one of the challenges has always been people applying from other countries and not being able to actually come. And so for the first time, now the thousands of people who have applied to Andela, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, but weren't able to join because of the challenges around work visas, now can actually take part in this movement across the continent. That's a significant shift from how we've been able to operate before, and that's a testament to the alignment of what is happening at every level in Kigali, and why you're seeing such incredible growth. It's that notion of we're going to be a little bit more progressive and focused on technology. We're going to recognize how big an impact technology can have on the future of the continent, and we're going to help drive that. And that's also just been exciting to see.
For us, some of the things that we would consider challenges are things like real estate space. Ultimately, when you're growing at the rate Andela's growing at, you're literally changing offices maybe once every year and a half. We've gone to 2 offices in Kenya. Luckily, we found a really big space there. In Nigeria, we're in our 7th office today, and we're right now looking at the next place already, which is going to be more of a big campus that houses us for the next several number of years. In Uganda, we're already doing a space assessment to figure out how we move next year. And so in Kigali, I think that's one of the things that we're excited about is being able to find really awesome space here as well. But in general, across all the countries we've operated in, finding really, really great space at a very good cost that allows us to expand the ability for us to bring people in has been a challenge, but something that we've proven time and time again. You solve that, you solve a lot of other problems that you might face. In terms of infrastructure, Africa has come really, really far. Yeah. And I think what's great for us now is we can actually see how that's played out in many different countries. I think people have realized that the way to move forward is to literally build infrastructure. And the beautiful thing about technology is once you have that infrastructure in place, a bunch of other things get built on top of it by themselves. So I think we're being very lucky. The last point there is because of the nature of what we do, most countries we've been in have been really happy to have us there. Operating in Nigeria is typically pretty challenging for a lot of companies. Andela has, everyone we interact with is thinking, how do we make sure you guys win? Because they can see the future. And let me just paint a picture of what the future looks like to you. You start off with a few of the smartest people in the country, and you get them to become part of this global tech ecosystem. They interact with other engineers who they may never have spent time with. They're learning the best practices in the world in how to write code. They're building apps that are used by millions of people, not hundreds, not thousands, but millions. They're in an ecosystem that really truly blows their mind. Living in Silicon Valley for me was a life-changing experience. So people, their minds get blown. But then you equip them with skills that they take with them forever. Those skills are never going to go away. And what happens when you get people that are really, really smart, and all of a sudden they're like, I can actually change my country. They actually want to change the country. And so now you end up with hundreds of people that are in their local country, a local ecosystem, and they're thinking, how can I apply my skills to solve problems here? And to me, those few hundreds end up training thousands, and those few thousands end up building things that are useful in the countries they live in. And what will happen 5, 10 years from now is we're all going to wake up one day, and we're going to think, why are so many of the world's most used apps developed in Africa? No one's going to know what happened. They're going to, why are there so many African entrepreneurs? Why are there so many African technologists out there in the world? And they're going to be trying to figure out what's going on. The minister of ICT in many countries, the heads of some of the largest tech companies in many countries, probably the advisors to the presidents in many countries, probably some of the investors, because we have Andelans that want to become investors in many countries. They're going to be sitting at the table. They're going to be speaking the exact same language, and they're all going to want their country to move forward. And they'll be able to get things done really, really fast.
Your story is a success, honestly speaking. Moving into the future, do you have plans of moving away from just an accelerator, coming up with different innovations in the industry?
So we think this story is 1% done. We're really just at the beginning still. And this is a story of a movement across the continent that is going to change the way the entire world thinks about talent. We have a lot of work to do from that standpoint. We're going to get better and better at that and focus on that. And as we're able to do that more and more effectively, we will have a bigger and bigger impact on both sides, both the technology shortage experienced around the world, but also on the ability to invest in extraordinary people around the world and prove that brilliance is evenly distributed.
Shen, Jeremy, thank you so much for having time to speak to us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
I know, eh?
Looking forward to the next time.
Hopefully we'll be asking what the hell happened. Where is this talent coming from?
We'll send updates, don't worry.
Thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Keep it CNBC Africa. My name is Maggie Motesi.